I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have a really special guest on this conversation today. Rick Rossow has been studying India for 25 years. He's currently the director of the chair in US India policy studies at CSIS. I like to think of Rick as somebody I learned from a lot, or should I say, I learned from his Twitter account a lot about the latest developments of what's happening, especially to do with trade and economics between India and the US. It's a fantastic week to have Rick on this conversation because he has really been tracking many of the developments that we are all talking about now between India and the United States. Thanks, Rick, for joining.
Such a great pleasure to be here, Hindol. You're such a terrific commentator and thoughtful person on everything happening there. So the feeling is mutual in terms of who we study and watch. I'm definitely one of your biggest fans.
Thank you very much. And yours. I want to begin by asking you, talk to us a little bit about what's happening in the trade between India and the US. We've had the friendshoring conversation. We've seen exports grow. We are constantly having this conversation about higher and higher tech manufacturing. We're seeing the explosion of GCCs in India. We're also seeing, the push towards more and more high tech manufacturing in India. From the vantage point where you are, how do you see this? What is exciting you?
Well, I'd say the trade relationship is kind of moving on three fronts simultaneously. In general trade policy, and when you think about it between our two governments, there still remains a lot of friction and tension. I think some of the steps we saw early on under Make in India, where you saw higher customs duties and protections, that aggravated a lot of U.S. companies. The United States had some retaliatory steps they took. A lot of this took place, of course, during the Trump administration, when every country seemed to be a target for a potential trade fight. But even during the Biden administration, you haven't seen either side really taking steps to climb down from some of this policy tension. So when we think about, the relative heft our two countries are going to have, they have today and will have tomorrow, you wish that our leaders would have a little more aspiration for how they can help drive, a real coming together of our economies. But so far, a lot of the general commercial issues have been more tension filled. Now, the good news is that real trade is actually progressing pretty steadily. India is obviously a crucial partner to the United States in terms of services trade, IT services in particular. You look at the RBI's annual report, and more than half of India's IT exports come to the United States and Canada. They don't break out the two, but you got to presume the vast majority of that is to the United States. And on goods trade, the United States is India's largest goods trade partner. Although if you add China and Hong Kong together, of course, they bump us a little bit. India is our 8th largest trade partner. So I'd rather have real trade be better than trade policy, because that means jobs, that means trade flows. The third area, though, which has suddenly caught some attention, is on strategic trade. When we think about the sectors that we both are jointly concerned about, China's potential to dominate global trade flows and things like quantum and semiconductors, 5G, there we're actually finding some complementarity between our governments to try to find policy initiatives, joint research initiatives, so that we can together hopefully begin to find and create alternative supply chains in these sectors that are important for us, both in terms of our trade relationships, but also, not allowing China to have a level of control over these items that it can be used for commercial coercion against other partners and potential security implications for it. So I'd say kind of moving on three fronts, two of them quite positive, one of them a little stuck in first gear on general trade policy. But even that got a little bit of a bump with the resolution of some of these WTO disputes during the big summit when Prime Minister Modi was here. So a week ago, I was probably even a little more sour. This week, a little more positive, maybe.
Let's talk a little bit about strategic trade, which you just mentioned. Talk to me a little bit about semiconductors. This is a field where we are seeing a lot of action. There's a real effort on India's part, and indeed great help from the United States part of US companies, policies really helping India to develop a real semiconductor supply chain. Talk to us a little bit about how you see this development. Of course, this is connected, as you've already mentioned, to China, to the fact that Taiwan is the biggest semiconductor producer in the world, to the fact that, especially after COVID and with tensions around China, people want, or the US wants, and many other countries want shorter and safer supply chains. Tell us how you see this entire move towards semiconductors involving the US and India.
Yeah. Well, taking a step back, again, at the dawn of Make in India, and understanding why the government in India wanted to focus on that, both between creation of low and mid-skilled jobs for ag workers that are going to be leaving the fields, India's massive trade deficit, and trying to offset that. So kind of understanding. It surprised me at the time, though, even though there was a lot of sectors that were announced. You saw when the Indian government was traveling the world talking about Make in India, they really focused a lot and more heavily on engaging companies that were in high-tech areas. And generally, when you see countries go through the industrialization phases, it starts with basic industries, textiles and basic chemicals, and kind of moves up the value chain. So to see the government start targeting Taiwan and like the high-end manufacturers right off the bat was a little bit surprising. Some of the infrastructure issues that India still deals with that investors have to look at, reliable access to electricity and clean water and things like that. The high-tech sectors too, like they have much higher needs in those areas than basic industries do. You think about a power cut, which happens throughout India all the time. And a semiconductor fab, if you lose electricity and you lose a slab that's going through process, that's hundreds of millions of dollars potentially that you lose because of a power cut. Whereas a textile company, maybe you lose a couple $100 worth of textiles and such. So, I thought at the time, this focus on high-end versus, paper mills and textiles, which actually produce a lot of jobs and such, it felt like a little bit of overestimating how quickly India could reach the frontier in the high-end manufacturing. Semiconductors, we really felt that direct push, especially with the block in semiconductor trade flows around the world during COVID. I know that a lot of the companies involved in semiconductor, they're already there in India in significant way, but a lot of times doing the back end engineering and research, not obviously doing production. And the companies would say still that, electricity access and water and things, I mean, as better as India's progressed over the years, it's still not world standard in a lot of these areas. Most states aren't. But, we saw the announcements last week, and talking to some of the industry associations that represent companies in that space, it feels a lot more real than I would have expected. Sometimes you see these announcements and joint statements, they throw out a number, it may never materialize, but my initial conversation with folks that are more deeply involved in this seems quite real. It appears that the Indian government is very willing to put the money to ring fence specialized infrastructure that will help to get us closer to the frontier for actual semiconductor manufacturing in India. So to see individual companies that make these announcements, of course, not the same thing as ground being broken, but if the government starts putting in the related infrastructure to make sure that it's prioritized, to make sure that, some of these challenges that they face in India, that the state governments hadn't been able to build up around, if that takes place, these look to be a lot more real and concrete than I would have expected. So again, India is already integral on the back end engineering and research for semiconductor firms. So they're part of the value chain already. But we know job creation and trade deficits are a big driver for both of our countries. And the reason that we're focusing on advanced industries right now, and it feels like, the Indian government seems pretty eager to try to make those co-investments to unlock some big investments from global manufacturers.
Let me take a step back and explain this to our audience, Rick. Why is it such a big deal for the manufacturing of semiconductors to move away from Taiwan? A lot of people in the world, the lay audience, don't quite understand this, how valuable this move away is, and why friendshoring, especially in this genre, so to speak, is so critical. So explain to us why this is so important. Why are the two largest democracies in the world after this as the big prize?
Well, with semiconductors, high-end semiconductors, it is kind of dominated by Taiwan. You've got some production in Korea, a little bit lower end in China. Obviously, the countries that are producing semiconductors for the most part are relatively friendly. We don't think they would use that necessarily as a means for commercial coercion per se. So I would say on the semiconductor discussion, especially the high-end work that Taiwan does, it really is about optionality, just to make sure that you don't have too much production in an individual country. We saw during COVID what happens if there's a a tsunami, an earthquake, a natural disaster of some type. What happens if China-Taiwan tensions pick up and trade flows suddenly begin slowing down? Companies don't want to go overweight in Taiwan because of concerns that there could be some kind of military action at some point, which a lot of people are concerned about. So with Taiwan, I think we had a real lesson in COVID. We look at potential things that could happen, and wanting to diversify supply chains, is definitely in our interest. But that also differs, from some of the other strategic technologies that we've been talking about, where over-reliance on China, which has used commercial coercion directly against a number of countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, the United States, if they begin embargoing, and these chips, what they do, they go into just about everything that we need for our modern lives now. And you say the same thing on critical minerals and rare earths. China is trying to develop a lot of undersea cables, and the concern that they could potentially turn those off at times of tension and conflict with other countries. So semiconductors, it is more about supply chain optionality. A lot of the other sectors we've been talking about, it's more directly because of security concerns about over-reliance on China.
Tell us a little bit about, when even 10 or 15 years ago, when you and I first met, I remember there were all these concerns and T-shirts in America saying my job got Bangalore, in the first wave of sort of outsourcing from India. Today, a whole new age of outsourcing is happening. A real back office, not just, the very basic work, but even higher end work is sort of moving to India. A real back office culture is developing. There are more GCCs coming up from various major corporations than ever before. But we don't see similar concerns in America anymore. What has changed, Rick?
A few things. I would say at the time, it was a little more in your face because a lot of the first work that companies were sending to India were call centers. And so any problem you'd have in your daily life, when your computer wasn't working, when you're calling your bank, you'd end up with somebody on the other end of the line. Maybe the accent for an American was difficult to penetrate. Obviously, the technical expertise would be phenomenal. You get somebody with a master's degree in technical engineering on the other end of a phone line. But for a lot of Americans that felt those jobs should be here, to have that day-to-day interaction with folks in another country, it created for some a level of discomfort. And a couple of things happened. Number one, the Indian tech firms, partially because you didn't have that dramatic pipeline of new workers coming in, right? You got a lot of people graduating with IT degrees, but at the time, 10, 15 years ago, very few of them were actually employable without going to like some type of finishing school. So the companies themselves felt they need to start moving up the value chain. They got to get more value out of those terrific workers that came in. And frankly, were doing jobs that were well below the level of education and skills, and start moving into higher end stuff like, back end accounting and research and engineering, and just moving up that value chain so steadily. Also, the call center work, a lot of that has been changing to machine learning systems. So now you call your bank and, usually you can talk through a computer system to get at least the first 7 rounds. Not that that's an improvement a lot of times. Sometimes we end up more frustrated and confounded than we were before. But those systems are getting better over time. So part of it, you just don't have that huge day-to-day interaction of common citizens. Some of those cases you might remember when a person that was on welfare in the United States called about a check, and that call got routed to India, and that one alone, started generating a lot of negative attention. You just don't have the day-to-day people interaction that's happening. And also the number of jobs. I mean, you had India's IT industry that would be talking about, we're scaling up 1 million jobs this year, and numbers like that. That was a little scary. So I would say the fact that India's went up the value chain, the fact that, we still have a vibrant tech sector here. We saw a lot of jobs that were moving to India, but that pace has slowed down quite a bit. So I think overall it's kind of come together in a way where, tensions have dramatically eased. You still, you'd like to see more mobility, the ability to expand the number of visas, cutting down the wait times, because a lot of the tech workers too, they do try to come on the United States shores and do a bit of the work here as well. So still some agenda work to be done there. You don't have as many visas as you did during the heyday of the tech boom and things like that. So I'd like to see more people being able to move back and forth to help to augment what's happening. But a lot of good stuff underway.
Part of that good stuff, of course, is collaboration in areas like AI and other fields, right? And in this, India is also using some of this technology and has already used some of this technology in what we now call digital public infrastructure. And it does seem that today, India and the US, especially after this visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the US, is working with the India and the US are working together to build what I would call a sort of a global digital public commons, right? Talk to us a little bit about this collaboration. India prides itself today for having built this entire digital infrastructure, which really worked during COVID. Fintech that works on your phone, all the things China at one point used to be proud of. And now India's numbers have gone up dramatically. But there does seem to be a real effort to build a sort of democratic global commons in the digital world between India and the United States. Talk to us a little bit about how you see this.
Well, it's a multifaceted beast, to be sure, what we're seeing happening in India. The government taking on roles that in a lot of the world, the private sector typically does, not always perfectly, to be sure. But we've seen that trigger a dramatic explosion. The number of people that have access to digital tools that have improved their daily lives, has been tremendous. It's impossible to ignore, and the lessons that India can bring to other countries, are powerful as well. But a lot of the technology firms, they also watch the development of technology policies in India, and both for concerns about protecting domestic industry, concerns about security concerns about data flows that are going to other markets, China, but even the United States to some extent. So you also see counter pressures in India where you have various versions of this data bill that have been hobbling through, for the last 15 years that would sometimes limit and curtail cross-border data as a way to protect domestic startups and industry that could also limit this vibrant IT service industry. So on the one hand, India has crafted new models that have important lessons for the world. On the other hand, when we talk about the big private sector stuff, potential limitations and curbs, although I would say every version of the data bills that India's looked at have, I think, gotten better and better in terms of the ability to make sure that you have unimpeded flow of data that moving to key markets there. So there's a lot of issues swirling right now in India. They're having a lot of different countries with different models on how to manage the data side. That's going to have an impact on what happens in the future on digital infrastructure, and a lot of countries that are trying to press India to consider their model as the best model. So it's a heck of a place to be in. India's carved its own place for its own people, but also we need to make sure that we've got some level of digital conformity across markets, so that we can actually enjoy cross-border benefits. And for me to take my health insurance to India someday in case something happens, and vice versa, a lot of benefits to doing it, but you can only do that with shared trusted partners. So that again is a real space for our governments to work on. And I'm glad it got some attention last week in the visit by Prime Minister Modi as well.
Just a little bit about AI then. That's another space, and a lot of this work is happening. Some of the cutting edge work, of course, in AI has been done in the US, is continuously being done in the US. In India, Sam Altman's comment that, whether another country could, catch up soon, got a little bit of bluster here in India. But be that as it may, these funny things keep happening. How do you see cooperation, collaboration in the AI space?
Well, again, Indian research and back-end engineering and such is going to be crucial for it. But the area that you might see India really kind of carving out products are going to be things that are built on top of platforms that maybe are developed primarily in the United States. But I think about all the sectors where AI tools are going to be disruptors. And a lot of that is going to start moving into, more advanced jobs and careers, which, to some extent, India needs a lot more expertise in those areas. I give you an example of what I mean here. I'm jumbling my words a little bit, but you think about radiology. Think about, in rural India, the ability to catch a snap of somebody and to be able to diagnose problems that are happening there. In the United States, radiologists are one of the most well-paid medical professionals in the country. They have a powerful lobby that's going to try to make sure that that they're not blowing the doors off the ability to start using AI tools to be able to diagnose people's illnesses and such, right? So it's going to be a while, I think, even if we develop tools and products that can do this, before you're going to have rapid escalation and blowout here in the United States. In India, frankly, where you've got a dramatic need for professionals in a lot of these areas, radiology is just one, but you can imagine a whole slew of industries where India lacking trained professionals in a lot of technical areas that are required, especially in rural parts of the country, and being able to carry around a smartphone and diagnose things. Could be soil health, could be a person's broken bone. So I do think India will contribute a lot to back-end engineering that goes into it. But the product stuff that everybody wants, I wouldn't be surprised if India's champions may be building on tools that are developed elsewhere. But India is going to have a lot more running room, I think, to blow out and really expand access to a lot of the tools that are developed and creating their own, because of the fact that India has dramatic needs in ways that AI tools will be able to accommodate. And it won't be upending the system the same way it will here in the United States. So I think there's a real chance to win both on the initial research side as well as the application side.
A question that I want to segue from AI to the other question that I wanted to ask, which is, of course, in defense, there's a lot of excitement, renewed excitement. There's always been this entire thing about how much technology transfer will India really get. There's a history to all of this. But today there's renewed enthusiasm about a really deep-seated, long-lasting defense cooperation and collaboration between India and the United States. How do you see that?
Yeah. I think the Indian government across a couple of decades now has really been focused on sharing access to defense IP, intellectual property, as one of the precursors to taking additional big steps in our overall defense relationship. India wants to be self-sufficient in defense production. 70 years of basically holding industry to public sector units hasn't yielded the high-end product that the rest of the world has been producing. I think the Modi government has spent a lot of time deregulating, delicensing defense industry for private companies, and of course doing terrific work in helping create a better ecosystem for startups. So today, when you think about the companies that could be partners to the United States, the environment's getting a lot better. You don't just have to go to defense public sector units. You can go to startups. You can go to some of the big engineering conglomerates that kicked out defense arms. So I think the options for partnership are a little bit better. The challenge on the U.S. side remains, you're talking to large U.S. defense companies, right? Most of the defense IP is not actually controlled by the U.S. government. It's controlled by private firms. And so, it's all out there for sale if India wants to buy access to the IP at a price, the price that goes into all an R&D that went into it. But, what India is really asking for is access to that intellectual property for less than commercial rates. And the U.S. Department of Defense gets a little stymied by that. How do they possibly show up at the negotiating table on defense cooperation and offer U.S. defense IP that's controlled by the private sector? Well, across the last 10 years, they've tried all kinds of interesting initiatives, creating different working groups on aircraft carriers and jet engines in 2015, announcing a few years before that the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, where we try to accelerate defense private sector cooperation. So even though you don't have a lot of successes from all those initiatives, I think for the Indian government, it shows that, we want to get defense sales, but at the end of the day, we know that overall the defense relationship is so darn important that if this is one of the precursors to building our wider defense relationship, we're going to make it work. And you saw just in January of this year, with the announcement of the Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies, the United States was planning another big drive to find innovative ways to accelerate the sharing of advanced defense IP. And, we made some of the same announcements, frankly, like a lot of folks that were there in 2015 when President Obama went out for Republic Day. We announced a jet engine group. We announced different defense technology programs, and none of them turned into anything. This time we re-announced almost the same exact things in January. Some of the folks' eyes rolled, but 5 months later, we've got concrete announcements that they're moving forward. Things that just 8 years ago we would announce and not be able to move on are actually moving now. It really is, I think, an acceleration about what we're trying to do. And it also shows the fact that, certainly from the United States side, I can speak to, this is being driven directly by the White House. They know that this is part of making this defense relationship work. And, at the end of the day, too, U.S. companies, they want to win the sales. But the U.S. government, they want to win the sales, too. But also they want to make sure that India has options to reduce its own reliance on buying from Russia. And if India is not going to re-outfit its entire military, which they can't, in a short period of time, away from Russian platforms, if they're not going to go in and just start buying U.S. platforms, if it's about a domestic production and we can contribute to that and reduce India's reliance on Russia, it's good for us too. So best option, we'd love to sell. Number two is help India become more self-sufficient. because at least that's helps India draw down its dependence on destabilizing nations like Russia. So a lot of reasons why we're behind it. But the big story here, I think, isn't so much the announcements. They've been announced before, but the fact that they moved from announcement to concrete programs in such a short period of time, just 8 years ago, when we already thought we're striking new mountaintops on the relationship, we couldn't get these things moving, and now we can. So I think folks in the U.S. government too that were in positions of influence 5 years ago and like, oh, it's so hard to get things moving in this U.S.-India thing. They got to make sure they keep reading the newspapers because things they might have tried and failed on are moving really fast right now. So things are accelerating.
Talk to us a little bit about something that you mentioned frequently on your Twitter timeline. And I think you're one of the few people who's really tracking it properly. Merchandise exports. That's something that, excites Indians a lot these days because, this entire thing about China having become this huge, marketplace for the world, manufacturing all kinds of things. And of course, India wants to use its own population and skills it has to become a big, sort of market manufacturing hub, which is what the Make in India program really spoke about all those years ago. And you have been tracking merchandise exports, which seem to be doing, better than before. What's really going on there?
Yeah, I would say India's trade overall, continues to shoot up. I mean, a lot of commentators around the world still consider India, because they think of a WTO meeting or something like that where it's been a little bit more tension filled. They think that India is a reluctant trader and a relatively small trading nation. But trade as a percent of GDP, India actually ranks kind of middle of the pack among the G20. And so trade is actually pretty vital. And imports, we sometimes decry imports and talk about the importance of exports, but the two are also strongly interlinked. You can't be a part of manufacturing supply chains without bringing in some level of input goods and such. Now, India still has a pretty sizable trade deficit, but the good news is, you rightly point out, India's exports have been jumping. I think we saw it hovering in the upper 300 billions on a 12-month basis pre-COVID. Now it's a little over 400 billion in the last 12 months. So overall, the story, is pretty good. I think, a few sectors kind of stand out. Obviously, while we talk about higher global oil prices is something that's been damaging for India's trade balance, but actually, India actually refines and exports a lot of refined oil. So, it kind of cuts both ways. Crude imports still are much higher than refined exports, but India does win when oil prices are high. So that's benefited. Obviously, the big story on cell phone and components has been tremendous as well. So you do see some sectors, some others like autos and auto components and pharmaceuticals. They've always kind of been there and been quite strong, but refined products, especially benefiting from global high prices, as well as cell phone and cell phone components. These are a couple of the sectors that we're suddenly looking at as a bit more kind of sunrise, I think, of late, and I think will only continue to grow. But the question is, with some of these PLI programs, the production linked incentive programs in different sectors, some of the announcements by suppliers on additional cell phone companies, and then some of the other technology manufacturing companies that are looking at the cell phone manufacturing story and saying, there must be something there I'm missing. So we do hear a lot more companies that are starting to kick the tires a bit and see if maybe, an investment they chose not to make 5 or 6 years ago now might be a little bit better time. So you look at the FDI numbers, and really, you don't yet see a story. In fact, FDI in India has dropped about 25% in the last 12 months. So you got a couple of great one-off stories. You don't yet see the groundswell, at least based on the government of India's numbers on FDI coming in. But I know from sitting in Washington, talking to companies, seeing who's going, you do see that spark that wasn't there before. And a little bit of tension, I think, in corporate boardrooms where you look at the numbers, the highest population in the world, 10% or 10 years of 6% growth and expected into the future. A lot more companies that haven't made that big bet, I think, are starting to look at it more seriously because the numbers are all pointing in one direction.
Tell us a little bit about all of this in comparison to China, Rick. In defense, it's quite clear, there is a strategic reason why India and the US are coming closer and closer together. As one commentator has already argued, that, well, it's all very well to ask, will India send its ground troops to fight with the US if the battle comes to Taiwan, so to speak? But actually, how many even allies of the US will really do that? The bigger question to ask probably is, will India ever turn to the US and become another place in the world which is totally dependent on US security? And the answer is probably no. That's why India wants to become self-reliant. So we understand that part of the story. Is a similar thing, do you think, happening in business and economics too? The US economy is still very intertwined with the Chinese economy. And we've been talking about how some of this is going to shift for a long time. Do you actually see significant move away from China and grounding, as it were, in India happening in the near or even the mid future?
Yeah, I think you don't yet see a ton of companies. I mean, they put investments in India. It's the base of manufacturing for a lot of companies, just because of the price points that China for a long period of time could hit, that were far better than any other place in the world. The Chinese government was able to develop quality of infrastructure, offering relatively low land prices. They just made it so darn easy to go in and create manufacturing at prices that nobody else in the world was able to compete with. And once that manufacturing is there, it's really tough to uproot and move out. So the drawing away, it is going to be slower than I think what people expect. A lot of times it's that next incremental investment when a company's thinking, all right, 90% of my global investment's already in China. When I put my next 50 million over the next 5 years, maybe some part of that starts going to other markets. And it also depends on what industry that they're in, because when we think about the groundswell of manufacturing in China too, you got consumer products and electronics and things like that, a lot of stuff that has less security overtures. And COVID, kind of behind us. So we all think, oh, we learned all those lessons, over reliance, and it's kind of true. But once you get back to normal days and you've got this huge manufacturing center and you look at the next other places you can invest in and prices for those places are 10% higher, you might just kind of go with what you know. So the evolution away from China, I think at least in the near term, you don't want to overstate how fast it's going to happen, because these investments are stuck. When you're there, what do you do with a huge manufacturing investment if you decide you want to start setting up someplace else? So the draw away is going to be, I think, slower initially than people are expecting. But as with a lot of things, it moves slower in a year than you expect, but probably faster over 10 years than you might expect. I think part of it depends on how much additional pressure U.S. administrations put on companies to start rerouting investments into new jurisdictions. Are we going to put additional restrictions on the U.S. trade with China on tech products and blocking imports from China? How much are we going to be stamping down on China routing those exports through third markets? I know a shared concern India has. Are some of China's exports now coming through Southeast Asia? For the United States, we think of the same, and even some parts of the Americas where China might be routing the product into. So, some of it depends on what the U.S. government kind of leads in. So I think in the near term, the evolution away from China is going to go a little bit slower if you track the numbers than what some of the shouting from rooftops might lead you to believe. But I think across 10 years, we've already seen labor rates in China going up now with the additional pressures from government. So I think that'll begin to accelerate. The countries that I would say even more than India got a lot of things right just in time for this. Vietnam, Malaysia to some extent, Mexico. They overheated pretty quickly. Because none of them can absorb the massive scale of investments that we saw from China. They don't have the labor pools. They don't have the land availability. So I think India is kind of defaulting as well into one of the next best places that companies are looking at. So it'll be slower than people would like. It'll be driven by certain sectors because, of course, having that supplier ecosystem and access to materials is going to be pretty important. So some sectors will move faster than others. But I think we look back in 10 years, and I think we've already passed the inflection point when companies have to begin diversifying. So it won't be fast, but it'll be sustained and probably accelerate over time, is my estimation.
Let's talk a little bit about space. the other sort of frontier that everybody's excited about. India has finally signed the Artemis Accords, which is what I think they're called. That has caused a ripple of excitement in India too, and I think also in America. India specializes in a sense in building space technology that most people wouldn't even think that India would build. I refer, of course, to that infamous now New York Times cartoon, which sort of showed a villager with a buffalo and so on and so forth. And India, of course, sent its low-cost space mission to Mars. But there's a lot more to be done in space. There's a huge amount of excitement and potential for collaboration. And I was wondering if you would care to explain to us how you see this collaboration take off from here.
Yeah, I think the governments, from my own conversations, at least with the US side, they don't know exactly where it's going to go to. They've got some projects in mind, some that are, I think, for high visibility, and obviously will show the gluing and cementing of our nations, like, training Indian astronauts and having an Indian join at the International Space Station. Some of the work that we see right now of joint satellite work to be able to study the impact of climate change on glacier melt, things like that. So we've got some tangible projects right now that have been announced, and we kind of know what's out there. But the more exciting area, which sometimes the unknown is exciting and a little scary, is trying to get our private sectors together. That's never easy for governments to try to jumpstart, but they do want to see what is happening, because in the United States, some of the more exciting developments that are happening right now, a lot of the most exciting developments are driven more by the private sector. We know the companies that are working on reusable launch rockets and looking at additional satellite work that's being done for internet access and things like that. A lot of that's terrific, and it's already fairly mature, so that may be a little bit trickier to buy into. But what I think has a lot more people excited is, again, when you start getting our startups connected. There might be some great challenge that an Indian startup faces and lacks the technology to be able to build the thing they need, and the U.S. company's got that, but maybe not the market size here. So there's a lot of cool opportunities, I think, that we're looking at, more driven by startup and some of the research work that's being done. So we know some of the tangible projects. Let's get astronauts in space together. Let's jointly use satellite work that we're already launching to be able to monitor critical things like climate change. But the stuff that we don't know is probably where a lot more of the excitement lies, which is what are our fun, cool startups doing, and maybe talking to each other and finding areas to collaborate. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to start building joint IP if it's done at the basic research level, rather than, as we were talking about in defense, trying to do it with more mature research. So a lot of excitement behind it, and not always a lot of direction, because they want to see where the private sector takes things.
Final question. You mentioned research, you mentioned innovation, you mentioned collaboration and joint work in developing products, developing ideas. A lot of this, of course, ties up to education and higher education. America has been traditionally a home for Indian students looking, and first preference for Indian students looking to go study in the US. Many of us, spend very happy months and years in the US studying in US universities and have very happy memories of that. But US higher education, especially in the Ivy Leagues, is getting more and more expensive. And that's becoming prohibitive, not just for people in India and other parts of the world, but even perhaps for many people in America. But there is therefore a significant effort to collaborate between India and the US to find methodologies, find models which allow Indian students to access higher education in the US, or access higher education from the US, if not necessarily in the US, including in colleges setting up campuses in India. What future do you see this kind of collaboration have?
Yeah, great question. I was running a program for the Department of State a couple of years ago where we were looking at U.S.-India higher education collaboration. I would say, kind of some key learnings that we had from that. I do hear Indian officials sometimes talk about the desire to see American colleges and universities set up campuses in India. Talking to American schools, that's probably not going to be the real driver of what's going to happen. The price points that they charge would be intolerable, I think, in India if they were to bring anywhere close to the tuition levels they've got globally. It's extremely expensive and a real tie down on resources when you got faculty and other things that you're moving to another country. They've tried it off and on, China and the Middle East. And very few of the universities, I think, really kind of at the end of the day thought that it was worth the time, money, and effort. But that's just one small area. As you kind of rightly point out, there's a lot of great things that are happening and can happen even more. You do still see a groundswell of Indian students coming out here, so tuition rates what they are. I don't think we yet see the pressure where Indian students are choosing away from the United States. In fact, they surpassed China as the #1 country for the source of students. But getting more universities to collaborate with each other on joint research, getting faculty exchanges. These are the kind of things I think that are pretty powerful and pretty incredible. But the biggest weak spot that we see right now, and I know the two governments are actively working on how to figure out a way around this. You've got a lot of one-way movement happening. A lot of Indian students coming here. You don't have that many American students, especially those that don't have any Indian heritage. Very, very few that go to India to study. So right now it's a little bit kind of one hand clapping. U.S. universities going there, sure, do research and things like that. Indian students coming here, but we know the weaknesses. You don't have as many Indian universities that are coming out here and doing programs. But most importantly, I think you don't have nearly enough Americans that are getting exposure to India at that kind of early age in college and going and seeing what's the place all about. I think, still as somebody who's been to India 130 times and you see who's getting on the airplanes and such, it's a lot of folks that are going there for religious spiritualism, going for, whatever it is. Fewer that are going out there for studies. I'd say more for business these days. So from my own recognition and understanding about who's traveling, I think we got to increase the pipeline, I think, of college students that are going out there and studying technology and studying business and doing things like that. That's partially going to be driven by companies too, right? When companies start telling the business schools, your graduates need to have a semester of India experience under their belt because it's such a vital part of our growing area of business. That's the kind of signaling I think that's going to help quite a bit. But yeah, anything governments can do to improve university collaboration, and there's some steps to do so. They want to see more Indian students come this way, but getting more Americans to go that way, that's really kind of the missing link out of this whole thing. And I do hope we can find some ways to accelerate that.
My last question, and I'm glad we were talking about people moving to and fro, because my last question, of course, is about diaspora. The Indian diaspora in the United States has already been called the other 1%. The most successful, the most wealthy, the most well-educated, and many would say the most well-integrated. But we don't see, and to take your point, enough Americans coming and spending a lot of time in India, working in India, living in India, and so on and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about how you see the diaspora picture unfolding.
Well, it really is one of the great underpinnings of this entire relationship. Our security ties have had their ups and downs. Upside, we announced civilian nuclear. Downside, when the liability law, basically cripples. Upside with winning some defense deals. Downside with losing some, et cetera. But the diaspora has been there through thick and thin, 4 million strong now. And the kind of role they play in society, the percent of startups in Silicon Valley that are founded by somebody of Indian heritage, university professors, number of folks in senior roles in the U.S. government, the Deputy Secretary of State. It's been tremendous. It's been powerful. And it's been a real ballast, I think, in the relationship during periods when other things really aren't quite going so well. So nothing but great things to say, even of course, the Vice President of the United States and seeing her interacting with Prime Minister Modi on stage at the lunch that they hosted on Friday, was really kind of a neat moment. Her talking about some of her visits to India during her youth to visit her grandpa in Madras. It was a touching moment and the kind of stories that I think are only going to grow and accelerate over time. So it really has been one of the more positive areas of cooperation, even in times other stuff wasn't going so well.
Wonderful. Rick Rossow, thank you very much for your time. At a time when I'm amazed every year how Halloween, which was never ever celebrated in India, grows and grows and has become really in many ways, even in small towns. I'm astonished to see these days that even in what we call tier 2 and tier 3 cities, children celebrating Halloween in India, and in a week when New York has finally announced that Diwali will be a public holiday. It's been a wonderful time talking to you. Thank you very much.
I think we enjoyed Diwali too, but Holi, I think, is becoming a favorite in the United States. Running around and getting everybody all covered in color, including sometimes they've got these 5K Holi runs, where they'll do a little run and then you get sprayed with powder at the end. So we're borrowing, not just yoga, but Holi and a lot of other areas. So more and more India is also being recognized on this side of the ocean.
I love the 5K holy run. Only the overachieving Americans can actually turn holy, which in India is all about eating and drinking and like sloth into something to be achieved in a 5K holy run. It's a bit like what we did to the burger. We made it aloo tikki burger in India. But thank you, Rick. Next time you're in India and if you're here for Holi, you're invited to my house. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thanks, Hindol.